All right, everybody, so today I'm going to show you how to make a custom wainscot radiator cover for your baseboard radiant heat to spice them up a little and replace those ugly metal covers. So this is the final product, but I'll show you the steps, and it's pretty simple actually. The only specialty item you really need is a router. You could actually use a table saw, but the router makes it a whole lot easier. You need a miter saw and a table saw. All right, so step one is starting with the top piece. So what I like to do is I took the measurements of the current radiators. You need the length, the depth, and the height. That's step one really. So get the measurements of your radiator, and just make sure you're clearing the pipes that are coming up from underneath or from inside the wall. That's number one. And what I do is I buy 8-inch poplar, so it's actually 7.5 inch, 3/4 inches wide from Home Depot or Lowe's, and I start with that and then I rip it down. So first thing that you want to do is create the top. So you go by the depth of the radiator, so it's 2.5 inches. I like to make the top 1/8 of an inch or wider than that, just to give it some extra appeal, if you want to call it that. So it'll have a little overhang from the sides, and you'll see that with the final product. All right, so besides the power tools, which are the router, the miter saw, and the table saw, a couple of other things that you'll need throughout the process. You'll need a straight edge, right angle. I use these really good GRK 1.25 inch fasteners. They're amazing screws. I pre-drill the holes, and then these go right in like butter. Some wood filler to hide the holes from the screws. This is extremely handy. I don't know if you need it, but you'll see why. It's just really helpful when applying or attaching the legs of the radiator cover. So you can get one at Home Depot. It's a right angle clamp by Bessey, if I'm pronouncing that right. Then a couple of clamps, a tape measure, and of course, don't forget your eyewear and gloves. All right, so I'm about to rip the top piece. You have no idea how many times I've screwed this up. So if you need a minimum depth of 2.5 inches between the fin tube element and the wall, you have to add 3/4 of an inch to that for the rails that hold the wainscoting, plus another 1/8 inch for the overlay. So if I did my math correctly, that's 3 3/8 of an inch. So I have the table saw set just over that because doesn't have to be perfect. It's just personal preference on how much you want the overlay to be. So I'm gonna rip this piece and then we'll start with the legs. All right, so now that the top is ripped, and like I said, just over 3 3/8 of an inch. Like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect as long as it clears the rails. So now that the top is ripped, I'm going to cut that to length and just make sure that, so that the length of the cover, minimum length, is 38.25 inches. And same thing, you have to add 3/4 of an inch on each side to account for the leg width. So 1.5 inches basically. So make sure you add that to the minimum radiator width, or the actual radiator width. All right, so we have the top piece marked, and just so everybody knows, I'm actually building the longer piece. There's 2 radiators I'm building here. Same depth, so I had the math up here, but this is my 62-inch long radiator. So like I said before, 62 inches, you have to account for the 1.5 inches on each side, or on both sides, for the 3/4 inch rails. So if I do my math correctly, 62 inches plus 1.5 inches gives you 63.5 inches. So I have my mark, and that's how long my radiator cover has to be. And now if you want an overhang, which I'm also going to do, I like to do 1/8 of an inch on each side. You have to take that into account, so you're actually 1/4 of an inch more than the 63.5 that I spoke about. So that's personal preference, so I'm going to mark it that way shortly, but I just wanted to get a baseline. All right, so the top is cut to length, and like I mentioned earlier, 62 inches long is the actual width of the radiator from end cover to end cover. So you need another 3/4 inches on each side to account for the legs of the baseboard cover that I'm making. So that brings you up to 63.5. And then you need 1/8 of an inch overhang, or at least that's what I like. You can make it less, more, whatever. So 1/8 of an inch plus 1/8 of an inch is 1/4 of an inch. So I'm at just about 63 1/4 inches right there. So again, as long as you have 62 inches in between the legs for the actual element itself and the cover, you're good to go. Everything else is really personal preference. So I'm about to make the next step is to rip the rails that hold the wainscot and cover the element. So I'm going to use the rest of my 7.5 inch poplar here. And you can either split it in half, or I like to make the rails about 1.5 inches each, depending on how high their actual radiator is. But I'm going to make them 1.5 inches here, so I'll probably have a little extra at the end. But again, that's sort of personal preference, but this baseboard cover is actually quite high. It's 8 1/4 inches. So you could have thicker rails and it won't look weird. So I'm gonna rip those, and then we're gonna be just about ready to put the legs on. All right, so now that we have the top made, which is this bottom piece over here, and the 2 rails, which are about 1.5 inches wide a piece, we're ready to build the legs. So like I was saying earlier, the minimum depth of the radiator is 2.5 inches. So the legs need to have another 3/4 of an inch, because the wood is 3/4 inches thick. And you'll see what I mean by that in a second. So 1/2 inch plus 3/4 inch gives you 3/4 of an inch. So that's what I'm gonna rip this piece to. And then again, the top I made 1/8 of an inch bigger than that, so it'll overhang the legs a little bit. So I'm gonna rip that and cut this piece to the height that I need, which is 8 1/4. So once I rip this to the 3 1/4 I need, I'll cut 2 pieces for the legs or sides at 8 1/4. And then once all the pieces are made, there's the routering, but then you can really start assembling this thing, and it goes pretty quick. All right, so all our pieces are cut. The top is cut, the legs are cut, and the rails are cut. So we're ready to start assembling. Power tools are done for a little bit. We'll need the router and the table saw again to rip the wainscoting, but I'm ready to install the legs or attach the legs. So I've marked where they have to go. And from earlier on, you remember there's an 1/8 inch overlay, and this is where the leg is gonna sit. This is the front piece. This is going against the wall. So the 1/8 inch overhang on this, the depth side or width side, will be over here. So if you notice, when you put one of these here, there's a nice little overlay just to make it look fancy. So I'm gonna use my right angle clamp to attach that, and I'll show you how I screw it together so it's nice and secure and strong. All right, so I'm using my Bessey right angle clamp here to attach the 2 pieces together, the top and the leg. So once I have that straight and nice and tight, I'm gonna unclamp it, flip it around, and we're ready to screw it together. All right, so now that it's flipped over, I just pre-drilled holes. I usually do 2 screws on each side, so I pre-drilled the holes. Obviously use a drill bit that's got a smaller diameter than the screw itself. Just helps the screw go in better and prevents cracking of the wood, which really sucks. So I'm gonna put the screws in, and again, I'm using these special GRK fasteners with the star bit. My phone could focus here. Best screws I've ever used. They're worth the money. So I'm gonna secure that, do the other side, and we'll have a top and legs. All right, so as you can see, the legs are attached. Don't mind the messy garage and some gardening tools over there. But anyway, so we have the legs attached. The next step is to start putting in the rails. So what I like to do is, I'm gonna need a measurement. So I rip these to the full length of piece of wood before I actually cut them. So they're gonna get attached on the insides of each rail. So I'm just gonna mark it with a pencil. That's the easiest way for me anyway, to get the length, and then I'll send them through the router and we'll be able to attach them. All right, so the next step is to use the router and create a recessed slide space. I don't know, there's probably a technical term for it, but I'm not a carpenter, to slide the wainscot sheets. So the router bit I'm using, their wainscot sheets are about 1/8 of an inch thick, so the bit I bought is just over that. So it'll let the wainscoting slide in there nicely, but keep it secure at the same time. So what I do is I set the router up so it's gonna go halfway in between the piece of wood. It's kind of hard to see here, but you know, just to center it the best you can. It really doesn't need to be perfectly centered, but so I'm gonna router the 2 rails, and then I will start attaching them to the legs and top that I already have assembled. And just so everybody's aware, I have this router bit set at about 1/4 of an inch high. And again, that you can change that to whatever you want. Just makes the wainscoting sit more secure, and I like to use 1/4 inch dimensions as much as I can, because I can't add doing 1/8, 1/16, 32nds and all that good stuff. So I try to keep it in quarters. So this is 1/4 inch deep. You'll see why that matters when I put the pieces together, and I need to get a dimension for the width of the wainscoting. So we have a rail cut to length. It's not installed yet, so I highly recommend, and I keep these, I like to create a 1-inch gap between the bottom and top of the center assembly with the wainscoting and rails. You'll see why, but so I made these 1-inch spacers, and I'll show you what I do with them in the next video. And it's basically for the rail to sit on them while I'm screwing it to the legs. So stay tuned and you'll see what they're used for shortly. All right, so I have my handy dandy Bessey right angle vise there, and this is why I said these spacers come in handy, because this sits on this, I clamp everything together, and there's a spacer down at the other end there. So I pre-drilled my screw holes, and I'm ready to attach the one side of the rail anyway, and the other side will be next. All right, here's a good view of what's going on here. So I have my 1-inch spacer, and I have my right angle vise set up, and the goal is to have the rail as flush as possible to this. So I'm going to pre-drill holes here, screw it in, and well, right now it looks like the bottom rail, but this is actually the top rail because I have the whole thing flipped over. But once I get those screws in, the top rail will be secure, and I'll be ripping the wainscoting next. We are ready to rip the pieces. So I wouldn't say it's fake, it's an MDF wainscot sheet that I get at Home Depot. They come in 2x3 dimensions in sheets. And I just rip them to the width I want. And if I need to stack, or not really stack, but attach multiple ones together, that's exactly what they're made for. So they're tongue and groove style. But this is what I use, and you'll see how it gets attached shortly. But I have my width that I need, and I'm going to rip these pieces and put them into place. All right, so here's where we have to do a little math here. So as you can see, I marked this is where the bottom of the rail has to sit using my spacer, my 1-inch spacer. So that's where the bottom of the rail has to sit. And this is all to get the right width for the wainscoting. So do have to do some fancy math here, but just remember, you know, whatever you cut the rails, right, you have to take that out of the equation. So my rails are about 1/5/8 of an inch. So you take that out of the equation for the width of the rail, and then you got to add back 1/2 inch, 1/4 of an inch here and 1/4 of an inch for the other rail, because the wainscot is going to sit down in there. So that's what that math is there. So I'm around 3 3/8. Hopefully I did that right for the wainscoting. So I'm going to rip that real quick, and you'll see how it sits. All right, so my math worked out pretty well here. So this piece is not secured yet, but it's hard to see, but it's the grooves that I made with the router, it should slide right on there and lock it in place. So this one I'm actually a little short, but I could tweak that. I'm gonna use my right angle vice grip, attach this, and I'm done. And then you could go ahead and fill the holes, the screw holes, and paint it whatever color you want. As you can see here, I have a funky contraption going on. The way this vise works, there's not enough depth the way I build these to get the vise to actually grip to something. So I put a spacer in, and then just a piece of scrapped wainscoting to kind of hold it together. But this piece is something where you kind of have to hold the bottom rail with your hand while drilling the holes just to make sure everything lines up. And again, it's not gonna be perfect, it's wood, but it's gonna come out all right. Like I said, just hold it while you're drilling your holes and screws, and it should come out pretty flush. I mean, the goal is to have, you know, no gap here, or the rail shouldn't be sticking out. So I'm gonna go ahead and attach this side and then the other side, and you'll see the finished product. All right, and there you have it. So the rails are secured, and that's how I do it. So I'm gonna fill those with wood filler. I won't take a video of that, but I'm pretty happy with this. So, you know, it's not gonna be perfect. I noticed that this poplar, it depends on the pieces I get, but you know, it's bowed and warped, and I have to tweak some things as I go. But, you know, you really don't need too many technical tools, I should say. This Bessey thing is huge, and I believe that's like 15 bucks. You can get it at Home Depot, or I'm sure Amazon. And if you don't have a router, you can actually use your table saw. I don't recommend doing that, but you can. Just lower the blade so it's 1/4 of an inch, you know, sticking up from the saw itself. And you can rip your rails that way, but would highly recommend getting a router. So, I mean, that's the only kind of technical piece of equipment you need. You don't 100% need it, but that's that. So I hope you liked the video, and obviously if you have any questions, just comment below, or, you know, I'll reach out to me. I'll let you know how to do these, or I can even build one for you myself. So, hope you enjoyed it, and give one of these a try.